Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of The Square. My name is Brian Green, and today I'm with Jason Mirise. Jason, how you doing today?
I'm good. Good. Glad to be here.
What are some of the common misconceptions people have about your role? Either not necessarily at Corgan, but just if you're at a party. What is it that they think you do versus what it actually is?
Yeah, I think that if I say I'm an acoustician or I do acoustics related work, it all goes to being you're the sound guy, or you're doing the AV related type stuff, or you're I'm behind a mixing board or something like that. To the average person just out in the public, I think that the folks in the studio here, I think they have a pretty good idea of what I do. Maybe not quite the extent of what we do. And I think when it comes to more of the interior design folks, especially the ones that haven't worked with an acoustician before, they're kind of expecting that it's going to be he's helping us with finishes. Just like how do we make sure that we put the right finishes on the walls or the right ceiling in, and it doesn't really extend too far beyond that. So certainly there wouldn't be a lot of thought to like the background noise stuff or the mechanical systems, but more, which is their focus too. I mean, their focus is the interior design. It's what does it look like? How is it finished? And so, I think that sometimes they learn then that it extends beyond that, into what walls are we putting up? How are we isolating spaces? How are we making sure it's quiet enough? That sort of stuff.
What did you go to school for?
Initially went to school for electrical engineering. So my bachelor's is in electrical engineering. And I thought all along I was going to design and help build audio electronics, like amplifiers and speakers. And
Is that what you were doing? Is that what you were doing as a kid? Were you like in a band and stuff?
I was always into music. Music has always been had played a huge role in my life, from being a musician earlier on, when I was a kid, to just being a music lover, and there's always been a connection there for sure. And I wasn't any good at things like English and history and things of that nature. So, the next best bet was, the science and math part of it. I wasn't terrible at those things. So let's see where that path kind of took me. And initially let's design those components that I was enjoying so much playing with, as a kid. And this was a long time ago, obviously.
We'll put a disclaimer in.
But this was when a lot of analog electronics was the main, and so we were still designing. A lot of Class A amplifiers were still very common, and even tube amplifiers, and it still are to this day. But there was a trend moving, away from that into digital, technologies, and that's what we see now. And that was not my cup of tea. I was really enjoying kind of the old school stuff, and went ahead, graduated, got that degree, but afterwards was thinking, okay, maybe this is not the field I want to go into, because I could see the writing on the wall. It's all going to be digital from this point forward, and it wasn't my thing. And I got the opportunity to work for an acoustical consulting firm and do kind of get into architectural acoustics a little bit. We were doing a lot of environmental acoustics. It was in California. There's a lot of environmental stuff going on there, regulation-wise, and noise is part of it. So but I got to mix in some of the building acoustics and how a room can affect the music being played in it or being recorded in it. And I took a liking to that. And so I spent a year doing, that job and researched where I could go and learn how to do that, get the education, I guess, in that. And that's when I transitioned to, grad school and got a degree in acoustics. Yeah.
It's funny now that like you've got the big resurgence of all the analog tech, right?
Yeah.
Like, that the tube amplifiers, you have like DIY kits, and obviously vinyl has made like a huge resurgence.
Right.
Do you ever kind of sit there and kind of look at the landscape as it is now? And
what's funny about that is that I didn't ever see myself like on the design side of that stuff. But as soon as the technology became available, I jumped on it for using it. I remember as a kid, the first CD players, primarily because I was a kid, primarily for the car.
Yeah.
And I remember putting a CD player in my car and thinking that was just the greatest thing, and I've never looked back.
Being able, I can still remember being like 13, obviously using LimeWire and just ripping and making my own CD. And I remember just like the freedom that came with. And then obviously now I've gotten more into, listening to an album as it was kind of intended, right? Because I think there is somewhat of a narrative that the artist can establish there. But it is so funny. You've got, you see like I said, like the vinyl or even, like the film photography resurgence of people. I think there is something to be said about that.
Absolutely.
That analog,
Well, I think early in the technology too, the digital technology wasn't as good. I mean, you still had that conversion from analog to digital. It took a long time, I think, to get it to a place where somebody who would be classified as an audiophile, somebody who is listening to things critically, would be okay, with the digital source material. I was first getting into this, the whole audiophile sort of thing, and listening to music more critically. People were still vinyl was common. Tape was still very common. There's still that analog source, that tape running against a tape head and picking up that signal and not converting it in any way. It's just going straight
reading
through.
It straight off, yeah.
And there's a purity to that. And you're seeing a resurgence of some of that purity, that not taking something and manipulating it.
Give me you graduate grad school, and then you're kind of continuing this acoustic, but with this architectural leaning. Talk to me kind of how did you end up here at Corgan?
Right. So I worked for a small firm between undergrad and grad school, and went back to grad school and got the opportunity to go right back to that same firm, go right back home. You
also, spoiler alert, you also got a private pilot's license in between.
Did that, yeah.
Just as like a fun goof. Just learned how to fly a plane.
Well, we talked about this. I mean, you're free, footloose and fancy free, right? That's,
right.
I didn't have any other commitments. There were no family, no children.
Right.
Got a decent job, a little bit of money to burn. Okay, let's go do something that's a little bit challenging. So that was fun. I also figured out very quickly that was not for me. I mean, for fun, it's one thing, but flying for a living was not going to be it was funny. It wasn't the plane part of it. Flying was fun,
right?
And I got the technical part of it. It was the communication part of it.
Really?
it was the talking with towers and ground and dealing with all of the people trying to keep you in the right place in the air and not run into other things in the air.
Because that does happen, even though
does
there's
happen.
a lot of space up there.
And there's a lot of communication that has to happen in order for that not to happen. But that was the hardest part for me. I was like, and I had a couple of situations that were just not fun, dealing, with, really heavy traffic airspace. It was not. I was like, this is not for me. Learning to fly in an uncontrolled airspace with no tower and just kind of doing my own thing was a lot of fun, but not so much when you get out there in the real world.
So we've got the plane. We're flying for the $500 burger.
That's right.
As you said, right?
Yeah, you get in the plane, fly to the coast, have a cheeseburger, turn around. Yeah, $500 later.
You're tired of doing that. You've graduated. You've picked up at the firm you're at, and then where does that?
Yeah, so stayed there for a long time, and it was a small firm, just a few folks, 2 offices. One in the Central Valley of California, one in the Sacramento area. Great group of folks doing mostly environmental acoustics, but I had a desire to get into architectural acoustics. I like the way, the idea of how sound interacts with the building and the interior finishes and how it reacts to different shapes and textures of finishes was fascinating.
Was there like a moment like where you're like, oh, maybe it didn't seem as complex at the time, where it was like, was there a project that kind of spurred that first interest, or was it just kind of a repeated?
There were certain rooms I'd say it was more when I got to grad school. And spending time around people where that was really an interest of theirs, and some folks who were musicians, and seeing some really cool spaces. I remember a trip to, this will really date me, it was to Bell Labs in New Jersey. And we took a trip to, at the time was the quietest room in the country. They had an anechoic space there. And it's one of those rooms where you walk out on a net in the middle of the room, and there's as much space below you as there is above you, and very deep sound-absorbing pyramids and on all surfaces, and one of those spaces where you could turn around, speak, and not be heard. And and in the background noise level is nothing.
Yeah.
So you can kind of like hear the blood flowing through your body. Sort of
your hair growing, hear your heartbeat. Yeah. That's terrifying.
But that was it was fascinating.
Right.
It was like, how can they make something like this? And how the sound works in that room or doesn't work in that room. So I think that was one, but also going to, seeing concert spaces, symphonic spaces, places where it's unamplified live music. I think, and where you have to rely on the room. It's going to be the room and the musician, and that's it. And where the seat that you pick will change your experience. That's all cool stuff. I mean, I couldn't deny it. It was very, very, very cool, and my focus started to shift more towards the architectural side instead of the environmental side. Planes, trains, and automobiles. Those will always be there. It's always going to be a noisy world. So, I mean, that's always, it's always something I can work on. But the architecture was what really kind of got my juices flowing.
So you land at Corgan, and what's your official job title?
Senior, what is my official job title? It's not acoustician, which
is what everyone knows.
Probably lobbied for. Senior acoustical specialist, something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? What does that? I mean, what, like, as far as like, what do you do? Like, how does that support the firm?
Right. So I think it works for pretty much every project. I mean, it's hard for me to see any projects that we work on where acoustics isn't a part of it. We're always, just as you walk into a space, it has to have enough light and it has to have the right kind of light. So does it need to have the right kind of acoustic environment, right? Whether you're walking into a lobby, you're walking into a conference room, you're walking into a training space or a classroom, a concourse in an airport, that is going to be an element of it that is going to affect you as the user or the occupant. So what I do is we come up with designs. Our interior designers, our architects come up with building designs, with room designs. I will look at those rooms, look at what they're being used for, and try to help them design, sometimes even down to the shape of the room. Mm-hmm. If it's more of a really critical listening space, I'll help with determining what sort of partitions need to go in between that room and adjacent rooms. And that can be all the way down to like literally box in box type of design to completely isolate it, say for a studio space.
Or a gym, I think.
Or a gym.
Done, yeah.
And not full, but yeah, designing an isolated slab to help reduce impact through the building from weight drops, that sort of thing. To addressing the finishes of the room. Like, for example, this space. You can see a lot of the acoustic finishes in this space. Some of it you can't see. In fact, the bulk of the acoustic finishes in this room are blacked out above the pipe grid here. And then the last component of it is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, was the background noise. What are the building systems contributing? And this is something where, it's not really under our control as much as it's under the MEP engineers' control. And so I will review their designs and provide recommendations to make sure that the background noise levels are in check. Yeah.
How responsive are they to your recommendations?
It's
is that
funny.
Always a battle, or?
Yeah. You mean our people or the MP?
Dealer's choice on that one. I'll give you the.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think it's relationship building first. I think that you have to. I mean, you can talk about your resume all day long, and you've done such and such projects and spent 20 some odd years doing this. But I think you have to work with somebody a little bit first, kind of gain their trust, and illustrate that you're able to help. And then once you're there, things go pretty smoothly after that, I think. And that's what I've learned here. I've been here 4 years now. I think I've built some good relationships with some good folks, and there is a trust. And they look and they go, I know that if he's telling me to do something, or if he's recommending us to do something, it's probably important. And I'm going to consider things like budget. And I'm only going to push if I really think it's really super important to push, because I'm going to try to protect Corgan, and I'm going to try to give our clients the best possible end result.
You talked about, really, as part of TDS, which you're a part of, and we talked about not putting all of the weight on the designers and architects they couldn't possibly know everything, right? You're really
have to know an immense amount. It's mind blowing to me.
And you're, you said, you're servicing this kind of one small area, but like as we were talking about, that small part, for, let's talk about like these corporate offices that we're doing. I mean, that can make or break someone's like, job, like a loud fan. It's like, oh, here it goes. We know from, 8 to 8:30, this thing's just going to whir up and just can't have meetings in this room because it's too loud. Those little things where you get to the very end of a user experience and it's like, it's hey, we've got the best finishes, we've got the most, you said that the light quality in here is amazing, it's an incredibly sustainable building, it's awesome, unusable because of I can't hear over a call or something like that. So it's interesting.
Absolutely.
I think I think everyone can cite an example or sound, which is like, you talk about one of the things, like we were talking about, like the tinnitus epidemic, right? People listening with the earbuds and people listening to music. It's like of all of the things, it's like I can't imagine, coming back to that. It's like you said, like I'm not saying it because I want to hear my own voice. It's there's a reasoning behind it, and it's interesting to be able to kind of collect all of that together, I guess, in one person. So
sure, we're in a studio right now, and I've seen and experienced studios folks who say they're coming to us and we're building them a new studio, we're designing them a new studio, and their expectation is that when they go to use the studio, they're going to turn the mechanical off because they've never experienced one where the mechanical could run the full time and they could actually use the studio. This is like a meat locker in here. And you still use it. You can use it without worrying about turning off the mechanical. That's what we want to try to achieve. That's part of it, I think. And yeah, you're right. There's from studio to a conference room. It'd be the same sort of thing. If it doesn't have the acoustic components as well as the lighting and the AV parts and everything else that goes into it, it's not a good experience. It won't get used.
I know, like in some projects, and I know Corgan has done some, and I think just throughout the market, there's been a few like where they'll have offices that are pumping in like white noise, like that. Or do you have? I guess how much of that are you a proponent of? And I guess where does that kind of start to fall in line with like, okay, we're trying to maybe eliminate unwanted sounds. How do we add wanted sounds? If that's a question.
I'm never there is. And we have clients that use sound masking extensively in their designs. And
I guess why would you do that in the first place versus just eliminating the source of the sound? I guess
so we'll use sound masking in an open plan office type of environment mostly. And that's to help you're raising the background noise levels a little bit in a hopefully an unobtrusive way, so that folks that are having private conversations, say in a row of desks, workstations, so that their conversations can be somewhat private. We're all talking when we're having conversations on the phone. We're usually got an earpiece in. We're close mic'd. We're talking normally, so having a little bit of background noise in the room doesn't affect our conversation, but it helps mask our conversation from, say, those that are a row or two over, or on the other side of the room, which wouldn't otherwise be the case. Not a proponent of adding noise in places where, like, if we're having a conversation, this is fairly close. But if this were a bigger desk and it's a conference room and I'm trying to communicate with somebody that's 20 feet away, I don't want to have sound masking in there to make it harder for me to communicate with those folks.
We talked about obviously the move from analog to digital devices. I guess what has been the kind of biggest change in your career that you've seen acoustically?
A couple of changes. One is in how we isolate rooms. One is a finish material. So I'll go into two different systems. And all the interior designers that I work with will be very aware of these. We are starting to use a lot more, we're starting to get away from standard framing, steel framing for our interior partitions. We're starting to use a lot of acoustic stud framing for our partitions. It gets we can really get into the weeds with this sort of thing, but there are a lot of benefits to having, instead of single stud framing, where you have gypboard, a stud, gyp on the other side, and say cavity insulation, right? That would be your typical design. But there's a direct connect, a structural connection, if you will, between the gyp on one side and the gyp on the other side. So there is a huge benefit to isolating that, to creating a break there. And that's why resilient channels, originally the resilient channels were a factor, and then isolated clips with hat channels. We would do that to isolate the gypboard, or we would go with double stud framing. So we would end up literally putting two separate tracks down, create an airspace between them, and then we put our gyp on both sides. Completely isolate the mass from one side of the room to the other side. And so we now have products that will allow us to just swap out the studs, the standard steel studs, with the same size stud, except it really is kind of a double stud element, an acoustic stud in this case. It's literally two tracks that are connected by a foam gasket, and it allows us to drop that into place and get kind of the benefits of having double stud framing, so without changing the whole overall width of the wall.
So basically, it's just the inclusion of materials that are kind of custom built for that purpose, rather than having to kind of manufacture or jury rig something like
or create a huge amount of expense by going double stud type framing. So now we're able to get that level of isolation in a conference room without having to, let's say, go to something that's going to really ramp up the cost of things and lose a lot of space,
right?
Which is at a premium. So that's one. I'd say that's one thing, and that's fairly recent. We've started to adopt, that into our designs. The other thing, the other part of this, I think, is something we see in this room, and that's all of these panels that are on these walls that you're seeing in the background are made out of mostly recycled plastic. And so you're seeing this PET, I'm trying to remember what that stands for. Essentially, it's plastic. And it's chopped up into fibers and put into these panels. And we're starting to see, we've been seeing it for a while now, but folks are getting very creative, obviously, using it. And the acoustic benefits are there as well. We use it as an acoustic surface. We can use it as a decorative surface. And so that's another trend, I guess, that's been happening over the course of the last several years.
As far as going back to the panels, like you can cut them, you can dye them. It's plastic.
Cut them,
like you can
CNC, put grooves in them. You can form them into different shapes. You could backlight them like you're seeing here. There's lots of interesting things you can do with that.
Going back to I kind of broached this subject, but talk to me about kind of the relationship, I guess, that you've had moving from kind of a consultancy to in-house. What has that been like for you?
That's been huge. I think, well, number one, I was never looking. I never even thought it was an option, quite frankly. I got a call from Corgan a few years back saying that they were looking to do this. They were looking to bring someone in-house along with other kind of technical design staff. And to me, there'd always been a bit of a disconnect, between the architect or interior designers and being an outside consultant. When you're not in the same office, when you're not, there's just that relationship isn't tight. It's not quite as good. And they're out of sight, out of mind, and there can be a disconnect.
Yeah, we'll call you when we need you, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think too, without the relationship there's in some cases, the designers look at you and go, "Do I really need to? I mean, do I even trust what he's telling me to do?" That's not everybody, but I think that's in some cases that's there. So being in-house, I know Corgan's system. Now, I mean, I've been here long enough. I kind of know the ins and outs of it. I've have relationships with the folks that I work with and building more every day. There's always new faces. And here's the other part of it. I'm not writing a bunch of reports, 10, 20, 30-page reports in some cases that, quite honestly, they don't want to read them. Mm-hmm. And I get it. Nobody has time. And it takes a lot of time to go through those things, and a lot of it's boilerplate. So what I think we've been able to do is is to condense it down to what's really necessary to work in our model, work with the drawings directly, mark things up, have a back and forth with the designers, talk about why I'm recommending to do certain things, and have those discussions and do it quickly and efficiently. It's to be agile with this sort of thing. Not generate a really lengthy report. Hopefully somebody reads it, accepts the recommendations, incorporates it into the design, maybe. I think this process is helping to make our designs better. The recommendations are getting incorporated more frequently, and the end product is, I think, improved as a result. So I jumped at the opportunity to do that.
It's funny how architecture combines. I mean, even you could think about like myself, like coming from a commercial film background, right? And then thinking like, well, why would an architect? Obviously there's the marketing need, right, for communication materials and whatnot, but to have a space that's focused on storytelling, not obviously the visualization part of it comes in a huge degree, but you're thinking like, well, what? Oh, I guess you can, like the building, there is a need for firms to set the, not the tone, but the understanding and the narrative of what a space is, and communicate that. And it's always interesting how all of these little, technical, artistic, it all kind of congeals kind of in this, in this center. And I think that's one thing that I just am continually fascinated by. Like you're talking about, like I have no idea how these designers do it. They're managing all of these things. One thing, it's like I'm the same exact way, and that's why I love having these conversations, because it's like you're really able to kind of pick it apart, and ultimately it's about solving a problem, right? It's about picking that one thing of what are we trying to accomplish here. But I just love that I just feel like it's the ultimate group project, right? You've got all these different specialists coming in,
right,
and kind of pitching in, and it never gets old for me.
I think being in-house, I mean, the architects and interior designers are constantly adapting to what the client is telling them, which some clients are, let's face it, some are better than others in terms of kind of knowing what they want. But oftentimes things are changing. They're changing throughout the process. And when I'm here, I stand a better chance of picking up on those changes and seeing them and making modifications, to the design that could otherwise get lost. I think, if you get one shot at looking at it, and unfortunately that shot was prior to the client making a bunch of changes.
Yeah. Oh, that was V3. Yeah, we're on V7 now.
Right.
Yeah, you're like, oh,
right.
Okay, great.
And I think having the relationships with the interior designers, especially, they go, hey, wait, there was a change. And it's a quick Teams message saying, hey, would you look at this?
I want to go back to like the tools. So you're not, in my mind, and correct me, this will probably be wrong, but all of the acoustical analysis, you're dealing with spaces that most often, I mean, there might be some adaptive for use changes, but most of the time you're dealing with spaces that do not exist. And you are having to conduct an analysis on a space that is immaterial. So how do you, I was like, oh, well, he's an acoustician. He's walking around with a microphone and like, reading the levels,
Right.
No, probably not, right?
Yeah, right. Most of the time we're designing, and we're designing a room that currently does not exist. There are rooms that we are doing renovations on or changing. So, going in and taking some measurements, you can do that and get some information from it, unless you're just completely, if you're gutting it and totally changing it, that doesn't, that's not going to be very helpful. But yeah, you're right. It's more modeling. It's more understanding the physics. And doing the calculations, and also just a lot of experience. You can't deny that when you've seen and worked on the same type of room many times, that you have an understanding of what works. So yeah, there's that part of it too.
What is the most surprising thing you've learned about how sound behaves?
It would be a very technical space. So every now and then we'll work on a room that is designed for hypercritical listening. A studio, so let's say a mixing studio, or we actually had a room for Apple a couple of years back that it was a listening room. It was a dedicated space for them to bring their clients in and listen to their audio content. So it had a nice fancy audiophile grade stereo system in it. And what you have to do, it's small room acoustics. And when you're listening to music, there's a lot of, especially, through a good system, or you're mixing audio content, especially music, there's a lot of low frequency content. And what people don't realize is to try to control that in a small room, a room, say, even the size of this, the wavelengths of that audio, the low frequency audio, are extremely long.
Right.
And in order to, there are only two ways to really control it. And the best way to control it passively is with extreme thicknesses or depths of acoustic sound absorbing finishes.
Okay.
So that requires a tremendous amount of space, and you just don't realize how, when you start until you start doing the calculations. I need to control 60 hertz. What's the wavelength of that? It's feet.
Right.
Many feet. And I need to have an absorption finish depth that's at least a quarter wavelength long in order to really effectively control the resonance at that frequency in that room. That could be a couple of feet of depth.
We started with let's say 20 by 20 room.
Yeah.
Very quickly we're starting to
And our designers look at, well, I'm going to put a couple of inches of something on the wall. and that's not going to,
Right.
it just won't do it. It won't cut it. So that's a surprising thing and something that has to be, considered. We don't do that a lot, which is a good thing. But when we do, it's like, okay,
That's an Easter Sunday.
yeah. Oh crap. That's something we really need to talk about.
What is your audio setup at home? I have an idea of what I think it is, but do you have like you talked about, music obviously being a huge passion. What type of music? Give me, you get home Friday,
Yeah.
let's say wife and kid are out. You've got the Friday night to yourself. We're going to put on a record. What record are we putting on? Give me the lay of the land on what that looks like.
Yeah, that's so I have two spaces that I listen to music. One, the living room. I do have a system in the living room that's going to be open to the whole family. I say family, there's only 3 of us. But they would have to deal with that. So if I really want to be isolated and just to listen and kind of zone out to music, there's a shop space. So we live in the country. We have a barn, basically, and part of that is a shop, about an 800 square foot shop that I share with my wife, and she has her stuff there too, and we store a lot of things in there. But I have a dedicated system and a space for listening to music. And yeah, when I said I'm kind of an audiophile, not in the traditional sense. I think when people hear the word audiophile, they go, okay, he's that guy that, spends half of his paycheck on
Records and
on gear.
Yeah.
Right. He's got a $10,000 amplifier, and he's spent half of his the worth of his home is in the audio system. It's not really the case for us. Speakers that have for the family use are speakers that I actually purchased when I was a kid. When I was first getting into it, working at a stereo shop, purchased some nice speakers with the free money that I had because I didn't have a lot of other expenses, and have kept those all the way. They're quite old now. However, the components have changed, like the individual pieces have changed within those. They've been updated and kept going. But from there, it's all modern. It's all the amplifiers I use are kits. They're all Class D amplifiers. I put them together. And that's going back to our conversation where we were talking about earlier, but how technology has changed, and at one point I didn't want to get on board with it, and it's come to the point where you can actually purchase amplifier modules and power supply modules that you can slap in a case, put together, and have audiophile grade sound come out of it. And then the one thing I don't do is I buy DACs, my digital analog conversion. I have a couple of nice DACs. The one I use out in my dedicated space it's 4-channel. So I cross over. I have 2 amplifiers out there, 4 channels of amplification running to each individual driver in speakers that I made. They're very simple, but I cross them over electronically with the DAC. There's parametric equalization built into the DAC. It's very, it's sophisticated without being too many components. And that's the space where I can just zone out. And I have a CD player there. I find myself streaming more and more as I go. And I use Tidal for streaming.
Because that's been I guess because there's been that, all that stuff about Spotify and like their compression and all that. And I think Apple Music and Tidal use.
They are getting more and more. And I think that's been the change, is that now you can go ahead and stream beyond CD quality. And I've never had a need to go beyond that, but that's there is great. And you're able to stream it and yeah, that's I haven't looked back. I still have the CD player. I still enjoy opening a case and reading the liner notes and all of that. But yeah, it's going more and more that way.
The liner notes are just like a completely lost art. I can remember, obviously the heyday of DVDs, right? And you'd have the director's commentary, but like in some of those special editions, you'd have all of this information supplemental to the film that you couldn't get anywhere else. I mean, there were certain editions where that was the only, copy. And I think, obviously like with the advent of streaming, like Netflix and all that, it's like you lose a lot of that. And
so it's interesting that you mentioned this too, because I think it's still the case. Streaming is not the end all be all yet. I'm still a 2-channel guy, but I could see myself moving to more immersive audio, to Atmos and the 5.1, the multiple speakers and being surround sound, if you will, was kind of the old way of describing it. One of my favorite artists is big on remixing.
Who is that?
Steven Wilson is his name. Okay. He's a lead singer and guitarist. He does his own stuff, but he's also has a couple of different bands he plays in. But it's more progressive rock type stuff. But he has been involved with remixing a lot of older stuff, a lot of progressive rock stuff, classic rock stuff even, into more immersive audio. So I could totally see myself going that direction. It's going to make the system a heck of a lot more complicated. More speakers, more amplifiers.
I think someone who can.
But and it's just finding time to go ahead and put all that stuff together. But you can't do that from a streaming situation yet. I think that's where he puts out the the CDs and all the liner notes and what went into making it and remixing it and the original recordings, which some of them are 40 years old, 40, 50 years old. But taking all that and remixing it from the old tapes and making it sound incredible again, very modern actually, is really cool.
My last question is, what is your favorite sound? All right, I have two things to say on this topic. One, the world is too noisy. So agreed.
So living in the country, there's a reason for that. Part of it is to get away from that. I love coming into the city. I love working in the city. It's fun for that time. And then getting back home and having there be silence is huge for me. That's a way of resetting for me. It's a way of when I'm not actively listening to something I want to listen to, music, mostly, then having that quiet so the sound of silence, I guess, is probably would be the first answer. But the other end of the spectrum would be, just live music. It's hard to beat. And that could be in a small jazz club, or it could be like recently, at a drum corps show which was a lot of fun, and that's loud and fun. Could be a rock concert. That's the type of music I've been listening to mostly lately. But yeah, I think those would be the extremes. It's either favorite sounds would be music, and I know that's a broad sound, but or just the resetting silence.
That's it for this episode of The Square. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.